Okay, right. So I'm joined this morning by Dan Tiller, a former firearms specialist with the Metropolitan Police. So welcome, Dan. It'd be really interesting just to hear a little bit about your career, what led you into firearms, just to give a bit of context, if you'd like.
Okay, so joined Met Police in 1987 and did my 2 years in South London on the beat, and didn't really, that was fine, but I wanted something a little bit more exciting than that at the time. So applications came out for the TSG at Barnes, and so I went over to the TSG, which when you're a young, 21-year-old, it was quite good fun. We had the period of the acid house parties, we had the poll tax riots. It got me into a world of different things I'd never experienced, like some plainclothes stuff, some surveillance stuff, and generally just opened my eyes. Really, as you go through your career, you tend to work in a bigger playground, if you like, each time you go. So when I was in South London on a division in Sutton, it was on Z District, it was a small playground, and then you go to the TSG and you get a bigger playground because you get a whole area to play with, inner and outer, with the option to go on aid to various demonstrations and events all over London. So it opens your eyes to even more stuff. You get involved with good operations. And then, so I stayed there for a good 4 or 5 years doing attachments to a murder squad and things like that. And then came to 1995, and I wanted a career change. I had to leave. I'd done my sergeant's exam, but I hadn't got promoted yet. So I decided to myself, whatever comes out first, I would apply for special branch, or as was then SO19. Because a few people from the TSG had gone to SO19. It seemed to be a natural progression that people would go that way because of the team element. And SO19 came out first in about the February, I think, of 95. So I applied, and a week later, Special Branch came out. So it was very close. Mm-hmm. My career could have gone, two totally different directions if I would have been successful there. So 1995 was spent mainly on courses for me, because even back then it was quite an onerous task to get into the department. It was quite hard to get in then, even though I do say so. There were many hundreds of applications for then quite a few slots. So it was quite competitive. So there were boards and selections, and then you went on a 2-week initial firearms course, and then I think it was a 3-week ARV course at Lippets Hill up in Essex. And the courses bore no resemblance to what they are like today. They're really not, but they were fit for purpose at the time. I actually ended up doing 1.5 ARV courses because I hurt my back on the first one, so I had to go off that one and then come back on the next one. And then before I knew it, I was through out the other side, and started in SO19 in October 95, and then joined the ARV relief. As we all do, everyone joins as a uniformed ARV cop. Went to Old Street, which at the time in East London, just east of Liverpool Street, was the only place where the firearms department worked out of. There's now different bases, north and south and west and what have you, but that was it at the time. So for me, travelling from right over west, if you like, of the M25, it was a bit of a journey every day, but it was what you did. It was during the time where if you wanted to be in the firearms department, you were in the firearms department because you wanted to be there, and that's one thing I think that's changed over the years. All the people that I ended up recruiting into the department, a lot of them were there because they wanted to not be where they were, as opposed to want to be in the firearms department. They just didn't want to be where they were. They didn't want to be on a borough, on whatever squad they were on. They wanted to do something else. But in those days, very different. The commitment to being in the firearms department was pretty absolute. And so, so the first time carrying a gun is quite interesting, because in the ARVs, as people may or may not know, you've got authority to carry your weapons all the time you're at work. You don't have to get special permission to draw them out or have them in a specific condition because of an operation that you're on. You carry 24/7 when you're at work, obviously not home, and it's with you all the time, and it's actually quite a thing to be coming out of your car to go into whether you're on an operation or whether you're just going to and fro, and people look at you and then they look at your gun. And it's quite unusual for them because police in the UK don't carry guns historically. You know, of the 140 odd thousand there are, I think, in the UK, only a handful, maybe 6,000 carry guns, something like that. So people will look and they'll point and they say, "Is that a real gun? Is that a real gun?" And so you have to explain, "Oh, yeah, yes, it is a real gun, and there are not many of us, but don't worry, you know, you should be reassured by it." So there's a bit of that in the early days, but you soon get used to it, and in the end, it just becomes part of your kit in the same way that you'd get your belt and your cuffs and all the rest of it, your gun and your magazines and whatever. That was just part of it. And then, yeah, so quite interesting first couple of years on the armed response vehicles. I then was part of the move down to Lambeth in South London, where we opened up the South Base. When I first started, I think there were only 5 ARVs that covered the whole of London within the M25, basically. They then put on an inner south car to cover Lambeth, specifically because of problems that they'd had down there. And that was when they decided they needed the South Base. So they moved pretty much half the resources of the ARVs north and half south. And at the time, the relief was maybe, I suppose, only about 18 strong, something like that. So there were only 5 cars out. And the other half of the department at the time were the specialist firearms officers that you used to only sort of hear about because they were always on these either doing weird hours or long operations or secret operations, or they were always in plain clothes unless they were doing something where they needed to wear their retardant coveralls and what have you. So we didn't see much of those really, but they were always housed at Old Street. So there was a bit of a 2-tier system there. The ARVs were generally the younger uniformed guys, or the older uniformed guys, if you like, and the teams were a bit of a mystery really. There wasn't so much interaction between the two till they brought in an interchange system where there were always 2 specialist firearms people on the ARVs in order to sort of have some more liaison between the two really. So yes, I went down to Lambeth, and then after 2 years down at Lambeth, I then decided that I wanted to apply to be a specialist firearms officer, which again is another whole world of pain because it is a really, really specialist course. So you end up having to do a long assessment and then other courses that go with wanting to be a specialist firearms officer. So I think all in all back then it was about 8 days once you've done shotgun and abseil and various other special bits you needed to do to join your specialist team. But I got through all that, passed all that, and I went on to my specialist firearms team in 1998, which involved a move back to Old Street because that's where they were. So I've just, when I thought I'd got my journey sorted out and nice and easy to come to and from work, I then had to go back to Old Street. I went on my first team, and that really opened my eyes to a whole different tranche of firearms work, because we would work a lot with the specialist squads, whether it be the flying squads or the murder squads or the drug squads. We do a lot of stuff in plain clothes. There'd be a lot of pretty boring stuff actually, because there weren't operations to go out on all the time, but generally we would go out on jobs maybe 2 or 3 times a week, and during the time that we weren't doing that, we would spend, you know, training or you know, organising vehicles, organising events, or looking after a kit or whatever it was. But we always seemed to be really, really busy, but not out on ops the whole time. Still did the liaison with ARVs, and I went back on and off on attachment for a couple of years. Back we used to do, I think it was 4 to 6 weeks at a time in rotation back on the ARV release, in order just to spread the word about being what on the specialist teams was like.
And just for anybody that might be watching this who's not familiar with ARV, you're talking about armed response vehicles. Sure,
yeah, so armed response vehicles. So yeah, I should maybe have explained that. So the ARVs are armed response vehicles, which these days, I mean, those days they were different mark cars, but these days they're the men and women from SCO 19 that you see driving around in the marked BMW X5s generally is what will happen. There are lots and lots of them on the street at the moment. I think it's operationally confidential exactly how many there are, but suffice to say that there's a good deal more than the 5 that there was when I was there certainly seems to be an awful lot more than that out on the streets at the moment. And the ARVs, the armed response vehicles, are there to deal with spontaneous armed crime or spontaneous crime where it's not deemed suitable for unarmed officers to go, whether it be for swords or for knives or machetes or whatever. That's what they're primarily there for, spontaneous armed crime. The specialist firearms teams.
Just to jump in, because what would be really interesting, I think, to understand would be, what does it take to be a firearms officer in terms of skills, character? What do you need to actually tackle that particular policing role? And then what would be a typical day, a typical shift for an armed response crew, if you like? What would that actually look and feel like?
Yeah. Okay, so it's still the same now as it was when I joined up. You still need to be a relatively experienced police officer, because you still need to have good, what we call policing skills. Just because you've got a gun, it doesn't mean that you're not a policeman. And certainly on the armed response vehicles, you're a policeman first and foremost. So I would say you need good judgment, you need to be calm, you need to be mature under pressure. You need to have a good knowledge of all your powers and policies, and be able to think quickly about how to apply them as well. It's no good just knowing them in a classroom setting. You've got to be able to think on your feet. What I always used to say when I was training people on courses was that it's no good being just big, strong and fast. We need to be agile in our minds as well, because we need to foresee problems before they come up in order that we can think about solutions, and we're already there dealing with the solution by the time the problem comes up. So it's already in our mind. So we need to be quick thinking. And there are people that come on courses that are clearly just big and strong and fast and just want to carry a gun, and they're generally not the sort of people that are the most successful. The most successful people are the people that have got a bit up there, as well as the physical fitness to be able to go through. And physical fitness is important, because job-related fitness test, I know, is a big thing at the moment. But I think the ARV level is still 9.4. SFO, sort of CTSFO now, is 10.5, and there's a reason for that. It's because you need to be able to deal with the baddest people on your patch, all the people that you were, that you knew from when you were at a local police station or on a squad, whatever. There are always 1 or 2 really bad people. Well, these are the people that the ARVs will deal with all the time. And generally, when they're out on the street, there is no one else to be able to deal with those people. So people must get in their mindset that they will be dealing with really bad people. And you can't be in a position where, if you're, whatever reason, dealing with someone or grappling with someone or chasing someone, you must win and you must get there first. It's not acceptable for some unarmed PC to outrun you to get to the baddie first, if that's what he chooses to do, even though obviously he's not supposed to and you'll be shouting at him not to. But you must get there first, because it's not acceptable for you to be slow enough for him to get there first, and for you to not be able to deal with what you must deal with because you've got your firearm. So so I think that would probably sum it up. That's the sort of people that we would be looking for on courses, men and women that have got those sorts of attributes: think well under pressure, mature, calm, fit, and they've got to be volunteers. You've got to be willing volunteers, because no one can force you to carry a gun. When you first come on your courses, it's something that's spoken about quite a lot. Are you willing to pull the trigger if needs be? Will you act on your training? And so during training, you put people into positions where they have to shoot or no shoot, whether it be in mock scenarios on the training site with the marker rounds, the paint rounds, or whether it be in the judgment range on a laser simulation. You have to try and simulate as best you can the pressure that people may be under if they're faced with a shoot or no shoot threat. Okay,
well, maybe if we come on to that now, rather than talk about a sort of a day in the life in a minute. But in terms of that dilemma, and there is an element of a moral dilemma as well, isn't there? To shoot, to not shoot. Can you talk a little bit around the directions about shooting? So shoot to kill, shoot to disable. Can someone tell you shoot someone else, a senior rank, direct you, a lawful order?
So the first thing is that in the huge vast majority of situations, it's an individual decision that has to be justified by the individual officer at some stage down the line, whether it be to an inquest, whether it be to a court, whether it be to an investigation. It's an individual decision, apart from one very distinct difference that I'll come on to later on. Shoot to kill is a very emotive wording, never used by the police, and that's never what people say, because it's not actually true. What you do is you shoot to stop. You shoot to stop, and you need to neutralise the threat. The targets that we're given in training have a big circle or oval on them that basically cover the centre of the body mass from about there all the way down to just below the groin, and that is where you are trained to shoot. That is, if you like, the scoring area for your classification shoots, and it's there for a reason, because if you hit someone in that space, you are more likely to stop them than if you hit them in an arm or a leg. So it's definitely not a shoot to kill policy, absolutely not. You're shooting to stop the threat, okay, by using the least amount of force, the minimum amount of force necessary. And obviously this is where the judgment comes into it, because you need to be happy when you pull the trigger that you've exhausted all other avenues. There is an imminent threat to yours or someone else's life, and as I say, you've exhausted all the other possibilities. You have no choice. You have to stop that threat, otherwise someone else may lose their life. So it's absolutely not a shoot to kill policy, but you need to shoot to stop and neutralise the threat. It's interesting what you say about arms and legs, because we have enough trouble trying to get people that aren't used to shooting to hit a person-sized oval target from X amount of meters down the range when the target is standing still and they're in a training environment. If you transpose, and normally in good light situations, you transpose that into a situation out on the street where your adrenaline is really pumping, it might be dark, you might be a little bit further away or a little bit closer. The person is wearing all dark clothing. You can't really tell what they're looking like. They're moving. This is the big thing. They're moving because no one ever stands still. Normally when you tell them to stand still, there's always movement of some description. And then if they're trying to run away when they're presenting the threat, it's a whole different world to standing on a range shooting at a static target. So it's just not feasible to aim at an arm or a leg and hope to hit it, because the reason you're firing is because there is an imminent threat to life. So you've got to stop that, and you've got to stop it by the best way that you can, and that's by hitting them in the biggest part of their body. The other thing is that also, if you're hitting them in an arm and a leg, it's not necessarily going to stop them, because even though they're down on the ground, maybe with an injured leg, they can still use their hands. If you shoot one of them in the arm, well, he can use the other arm, so you need to be in a position where you're neutralizing the threat, and so that's why you aim for the center body mass.
I think you think about, or people non-firearms specialists like me think about neutralizing a threat where you might disable somebody when they're not necessarily, you find yourself dealing with a call where they might be wielding a horrendous weapon, causing huge amounts of danger to people around them. But if you stop them moving and their ability, their range, if you like, you minimize the threat there and then.
And that's fine if you do that, obviously. So if I'm talking about situations where you might be coming against someone with a gun, clearly that's got a range of 20, 30, 50, 100 meters, maybe more. Of course, if you're using the example of someone with a machete or someone with a knife, where there are firearms officers there, then of course, clearly the first thing to do is not to shoot, because that's the last thing that you want to have to do. And remember what we said, we've got to exhaust all other options. So you've obviously got to clear the area around the person with the knife. You've obviously got to talk to him. You've got to, and this is what I'm saying about having it up there, you need to have the wherewithal and the experience to be able to try and talk the person out of the problem. And then you've still got lots of other options. You've got your ASP, you've got your taser, you've got your CS spray, although we generally wouldn't be using that in a firearms situation because we don't want to be disabling ourselves or one of the other firearms officers with CS gas. You've got a dog, potentially. You've got shields. You've got lots of other things you can do. You can create space, create a safe distance. You can talk to people. So that's what I'm saying. And if you use your firearm in that situation, you're going to be quizzed at length, quite rightly too, about why you used your firearm when you hadn't actually ticked off all these other things. And what the law says, it must have been tried and failed or unlikely to succeed if tried. Okay, that's what the law says. So it's very easy for people to say in a farm situation, oh, maybe why can you shoot them in the arm or the leg? Generally, that's just not what happens because it's just not feasible. But when you're talking about the knife or the machete situation, then absolutely totally different. Then you would be able to back off. What you would probably have is you'd probably have someone, if it was so dangerous, you'd probably have someone, one of the farms officers with a gun out, but he wouldn't be taking the lead. There'd be someone there with a taser or with a less lethal option that would be taking the lead, because obviously you want to use the least force possible. But you've got to know that if you get rushed or someone gets rushed with someone with a machete, and for whatever reason your other options don't work of your less lethal armory, if you like, then you have to be prepared to be able to stop an imminent threat to life, which is why there's someone with a gun is there. And these are all situations that you would go through in training, working in pairs, one person taking the lead with the less lethal, etc., in order that you can cover all options. And that's what we're saying about during the training. You need to have the presence of thought to sort all these options out in your mind and choose which correctly meets the threat at the time. And threat assessment is one of the biggest things where people don't pass on courses simply because they get their threat assessment wrong. They go for a big option too early, or they end up not being able to choose the correct option, or they end up not being able to realise that sometimes, you might have to shoot this person. So are you going to do it or not?
Yeah, and that leads me on to that moral dilemma question, which I think is very relevant in policing today, that the ethical, moral situation that people are in. What goes through your mind at that point on a personal level? When you're at that point of having to make that decision, what actually goes through your mind?
So fortunately, I've not been in the position where I've actually had to pull the trigger. I've been in a position where I maybe could have done on a couple of occasions, or just about to, whatever, but it's not actually happened to me. Lots of things go through your mind. One of them is not. It's your training kicks in, and you're there to assess threats, and that's really what you're doing. In the back of your mind, there might be something saying, okay, this is going to affect my career, this might affect my livelihood, am I going to be up in front of an inquest, or am I going to maybe go to court, am I going to lose my job? So these things are all there in the back of your mind, but when it comes to actually whether you're going to pull the trigger or not, when you're at that stage of the farms operation, everything seems to funnel down to what you've got in front of you and to make the right decision. And really, once you reach the stage of going out on the street in an ARV or as a specialist farms officer on a team, you should have already made peace with those decisions and dilemmas, if you like, and you should be in the place where you're relying on your training, you're relying on the fact that you're able to take in all the scenario around you and the circumstances, you're able to run through the decision model in your head about what you could and couldn't do and various other options and make the right decision. And to be honest, all your brain power is taken up making those decisions in that split second, because all the other stuff should really have been squared away in your mind. Now, no one ever wants to take a life, of course they don't. But there is a feeling that people join the farms department because they're willing to do a job perhaps that other people aren't willing to do. And this is another argument maybe to to say why all police shouldn't be armed. And I know there's a conversation about it every few years when we're event led into police being armed or not. But generally there are lots and lots of policemen that would not want to be armed and that wouldn't be happy carrying a gun and say that they wouldn't be able to shoot, which is the reason why it's horses for courses, isn't it? You need certain people in certain jobs.
No, absolutely. And I'm guessing extra first aid training, body worn cameras, the sorts of things to give you extra skills and extra protection when
absolutely. So I mean, these days the kit, you are very well protected. Really good body armor, helmets, gloves. You've got your vest that goes over the top that carries all your kit. Yes, you've got your body worn video these days, and you know, the information that I have from friends of mine that are still working at the moment is that, you know, it's seen by the vast majority of officers in the vast majority of cases as a really good thing. And it's helped officers an awful lot because, you know, everyone goes out there with an honest mindset. Everyone's trying to do a good job. And over the years, a lot of the problems have come from the fact that it's the officer's word against the word of the person that's making an allegation against them or making a complaint against them. And actually, a lot of the time, you just turn on the replay of the video, or the investigating officers turn on the video, and it's an open and shut case. It's an open and shut case because it's absolutely as the officer has said the situation was. So all the allegations and the counter allegations, they go away. So that's a really good thing. First aid training, yes. So there's different levels of first aid training. You obviously do an initial part when you join the police, but then you do an extra part when you join a firearms department, the ballistic first aid, and then you can do advanced medic training as well. So there are some quite highly skilled medics within the firearms department, because generally what we find is that an area that we would go into, or an arena that we would go into, we would only want armed people to be in there, what we would call the red zone, if you like. So we wouldn't be able to take ambulance people or paramedics. We wouldn't be able to take them right up close to maybe a house that we were going into, whatever. They would always have to be one leap further away, maybe 50, 80 yards down the road. So it's really important that we've got first aid capability within the team, both for someone that might get injured on the operation, whether it be one of the suspects or one of ourselves. So yeah, again, that's very important. But people should have confidence in the kit that we've got now, because believe me, 20, 25 years ago, we didn't have that. And I know people 20 years before that, you know, they didn't have the kit that we had in the mid 90s. You know, we were just at the start of the ballistic helmets, for example. We were just at the start of the new style of body armor and various other bits of protection that you get. But now the protection is really, really good. And the risk assessment that goes into jobs as well, far more robust than it used to be. So, you know, the men and women that are going out to do that very dangerous job are generally more protected than they ever have been before. And the other thing that protects them is numbers as well. You know, we always go into operations not necessarily being scared or being apprehensive, but there's always an element of what's going to happen. But that's allayed quite a lot by the fact that generally you will have the element of surprise, and you will have good kit, good training, which probably the suspect won't have in you know, 99 times out of 100. But you'll also, you know, you'll outnumber them by quite a good number. So generally, if you've got more people, more kit, element of surprise, and better training, you'll probably win out. So I think they're in a really good place as it comes to kit at the moment. Lots of money is being spent to keep everyone safe. The training is more than it ever was before now. I think the training is now, if you include all the courses, from someone arriving at the gates of the Firearms Training Centre to being deployed on an ARV, I think it's 11 weeks now, because they do some extra threat assessment training as well. So that's training on 2 firearms, all the tactics, less lethal, all the scenarios, all the shooting practice to be able to be qualified to actually hit the target, and all the other bits. It's about 11 weeks to be qualified to get out there on an ARV. What I would say though is that the level of experience out there at the moment on the ARVs is being gained more slowly than it was when I was doing it, simply because there's more of them. There are so many more ARVs than there were, and if you can imagine there are 2 or 3 jobs every day, well, we used to do all those. We used to go
Yeah.
to every job because we had to. Well, now you maybe would get, you know, a snippet, one of those jobs per week, perhaps, for the ARVs. So that's an issue. But on the other hand, you know, we're one of the few people that can't create our own work. We have to be event-led, certainly when it comes to firearms work. Now, what happens now, again, is not like when we would go out on patrol back in the mid-90s, in the early days of the ARVs, where you would basically drive around and wait for armed crime to happen. Now, the cars are specifically tasked by the boroughs that they're going to. So they'll be assigned to the borough of, I don't know, Lambeth, for example. And within that borough, they will have things that they will have to go and do. They will have to maybe perform stops on nominal suspects. They'll have to help out local officers doing, if you like, unarmed, specifically unarmed jobs. They'll stand by while other people are being searched, or they might go and stop and search people themselves in a way that we would never do that before, simply because if you were to tie up maybe 20 or 30% of your resources for the whole of London with one car doing one job, and you end up arresting someone and you're off the road, well, that's going to be no good, because the firearms job will then come in that you can't go and deal with. But now, with the amount of ARVs that there are out there, there's lots and lots and lots of spare cops in uniform out on the street. Yes, they're providing a high visibility presence, but they're also a resource to be used for the people of London. It's unreasonable now for that many people to just be driving around waiting for armed crime, which is why they're tasked now with other non-armed crime as well. But it is also reassuring for the public to see the ARVs out there. I think it's reassuring, but that's because I know the level of training and the level of skill that the boys and girls have got. But I hope that that's what the public would see, and they'd be reassured by the fact that armed police were there as opposed to scared. That's how I see it.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I'm going to just stop here because we've just come towards the end of this first section.
Okay.
And in the second session that we're going to do, we're going to be able to talk about the post-incident procedure, what actually happens in the event that you do have to discharge your firearm. And we're going to run through a case study of a scenario that you were involved in that looks at the strategic planning, the risk assessing, and the actual operational function of the firearms teams when they're dealing with an incident.
Sure.
So absolutely fabulously interesting insight, Dan. Thank you ever so much, and I'm really looking forward to the next conversation to cover those other topics.
Okay.
So thank you.
Then.
Okay.